What if I told you that the man celebrated as the greatest investor of all time, the one whose story is sold as pure rags to riches through grit and compound interest, actually started life with invisible advantages most people conveniently erase from the legend, and that those advantages were the real reason he turned a modest head start into $200 billion while preaching the gospel of starting with nothing? Yeah, you heard that right. Warren Buffett, born in 1930 into an upper-middle-class family in Omaha. With a father who was a stockbroker and later a 4-term United States Congressman, had access to financial newspapers, brokerage offices, and influential mentors from the time he was a boy, and was already buying stocks at age 11 with money earned from newspaper routes and pinball machines. If you think the Buffett myth of the kid from nowhere who beat the market with nothing but patience is the full story, then you're about to get the most intelligent, uncomfortable truth you have ever heard. Because today we are ripping open Warren Buffett's secret. He did not start with zero. The sarcastic reality of how early exposure to capital markets, a father in finance and politics, and a network that delivered deals and information long before he had serious capital, created the runway for his compound interest magic. And the deeper lesson that great wealth almost always begins with some form of invisible head start that the started with nothing myth conveniently erases. Stick with me until the very last word. Because the verified family background, the childhood stock purchases, the mentors who shaped him, the famous quote where Buffett himself admits he was born in the right place at the right time, and the powerful, uncomfortable truth about how timing, environment, and access quietly launch almost every fortune will leave you equal parts enlightened and rethinking every self-made story you have ever heard. If you're tired of the sanitized rags to riches fairy tales, and you want the real mechanics of how billion-dollar fortunes are actually built, hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on notifications so you never miss these deep dives, and drop a comment below telling me whether you still believe the started with nothing myth, or if this Head Start reality has you seeing every success story differently. I read every single comment, and we are building this conversation together as a community that demands the real, unfiltered truth behind the legends. Welcome to Money's Hidden Past. Rich people lied, we fact-checked. Let us begin in 1930 in the comfortable middle-class neighborhood of Omaha, Nebraska, because that is where the Buffett story actually starts. Not in poverty, but in a stable upper-middle-class household that gave young Warren advantages most children of the Great Depression could only dream about. Warren Edward Buffett was born on August 30th, 1930, the second of 3 children to Howard Buffett and Layla Stahl Buffett. Howard was a stockbroker who owned his own brokerage firm and later served 4 terms as a United States Congressman representing Nebraska as a Republican. The family lived in a solid house. Warren had his own room, and the dinner table conversations revolved around stocks, markets, and politics from the time he could talk. Unlike millions of American families wiped out by the Great Depression, the Buffetts were never hungry, never evicted, and never without access to information. Howard subscribed to every major financial newspaper and magazine, and young Warren devoured them all. By age 7, he was borrowing books on finance from the public library and calculating compound interest on scraps of paper. At age 11, he made his first stock purchase, 3 shares of Citi's Service preferred for himself, and 3 for his sister using money saved from delivering newspapers and setting up pinball machines with a friend in local barbershops. Those early trades were not the desperate moves of a poor kid scraping by. They were the calculated experiments of a boy with direct access to brokerage offices, real-time market data, and a father who could explain balance sheets and annual reports over breakfast. This is the first invisible head start the myth erases. Warren Buffett did not discover Wall Street as a struggling adult. He grew up inside it. The second advantage that gets airbrushed out of every motivational speech is the political and social network that came with his father's career. When Howard Buffett was elected to Congress in 1943, the family moved to Washington, D.C. for several years. 12-year-old Warren had the run of the Capitol building, met powerful politicians, and watched how government policy moved markets in real time. Back in Omaha, after the family returned, he continued to spend weekends and summers in his father's brokerage office, where clients and colleagues discussed deals that ordinary kids never heard about. By his teens, Warren was already analyzing companies, writing reports, and pitching ideas to adults who took him seriously because of who his father was. This network did not hand him millions, but it handed him something more valuable: early access to information mentors and opportunities that compounded over decades. When he later enrolled at the Wharton School and then transferred to the University of Nebraska, he was not the wide-eyed outsider from nowhere. He was the kid who had already read every annual report in his father's library and who used his summers to sell used golf balls and manage newspaper routes with the efficiency of a miniature conglomerate. The sarcastic truth here is that the story of Buffett starting with nothing ignores how his environment gave him decades of runway before he even left high school. Most people hear about the paper route and imagine poverty. They miss the brokerage office down the hall and the congressman at the dinner table. By the time Buffett graduated from the University of Nebraska in 1950 and headed to Columbia Business School to study under the legendary Benjamin Graham, he was already far ahead of his peers. Graham, the father of value investing, became his most famous mentor, but the relationship was possible only because Buffett had spent years preparing himself with the kind of financial literacy most people never acquire in a lifetime. After earning his master's degree, Buffett returned to Omaha, worked briefly for his father's firm, then struck out on his own in 1956 with $105,000 raised from family and friends, including his own savings. That seed capital, the famous Buffett partnership, was not scraped together from nothing. It was the product of years of newspaper routes, pinball profits, and early stock gains compounded inside a household that understood markets. The partnership delivered spectacular returns, and by 1969, when Buffett closed it to focus on Berkshire Hathaway, he had already turned that initial money into millions. The compound interest story everyone loves is true, but it only worked because he had the head start the network in the decades of uninterrupted runway that most people never receive. Buffett himself has never hidden this reality, even if the motivational industrial complex does. In interviews and letters to shareholders, he has repeatedly said, "I was born in the right place, at the right time, in the right country," and that he won the ovarian lottery by being born in the United States in the 20th century with access to capital markets and the rule of law. He has joked that his greatest advantage was being born male and white in 1930 when opportunity was heavily skewed. The uncomfortable lesson the myth erases is that great wealth almost always begins with some form of invisible head start, timing, environment access, or family that gives one person decades more runway than another. Buffett's genius is undeniable. His patience, discipline, and ability to compound returns over 70-plus years are superhuman, but those traits operated on top of advantages most people never get. The paper route and pinball machines make for great storytelling, but they were side hustles inside a stable upper-middle-class home with a father who could explain price to earnings ratios before Warren could drive. The compound interest machine only produced $200 billion because it had an early full tank of fuel and a clear road that most drivers never see. The deeper, powerful truth that makes this story instructive rather than discouraging is that the head start is only the beginning. Buffett took every advantage he was given and multiplied it through relentless reading, obsessive focus, and an almost inhuman willingness to say no to distractions. He read thousands of annual reports, spent decades studying businesses, and built a network of brilliant partners like Charlie Munger who sharpened his thinking. He lived in the same modest house in Omaha for decades, drove an old car, and ate at the same steakhouse, because he understood that lifestyle creep is the silent killer of compound interest. The myth says he started with zero and won through grit alone. The reality is, he started with a meaningful head start, and then applied grit, patience, and capital allocation at a level few humans can sustain. That combination is what turned an upper-middle-class Omaha kid into the Oracle of Omaha. The lesson is uncomfortable because it forces us to admit that invisible advantages matter, but it is also empowering, because it shows that once the runway is there, the person who controls the throttle decides how far the plane flies. Buffett controlled his throttle better than anyone in history. Critics sometimes use this nuance to dismiss Buffett entirely, claiming he was never truly self-made. That misses the point completely. Almost no one is truly self-made in the absolute zero sense the myth sells. The real question is what you do with the runway you are given. Buffett took his early exposure, his father's network, and his head start, and turned them into the most successful long-term investment record ever compiled. He has given away more than $50 billion through the Giving Pledge, and continues to live modestly while teaching generations through his annual letters. The story is not diminished by acknowledging the head start, it is enriched by it, because it shows that even with advantages, the game still requires decades of disciplined execution that most people refuse to deliver. From the brokerage office afternoons with his father, to the first stock purchase at age 11, to the $200 billion fortune built over 75 years, Warren Buffett's life is the ultimate case study in asymmetric advantages, meeting unbreakable discipline. The popular myth of starting with absolute zero sells hope, but the real story sells something far more useful. The understanding that great wealth almost always begins with some form of invisible head start that the started with nothing narrative conveniently erases. Buffett was born in the right place at the right time with the right access, and then spent a lifetime making the most of it. That is the secret he never hides, but that the motivational world rarely tells you straight. If this deep dive into Warren Buffett's secret, he did not start with zero, and the uncomfortable truth about how every great fortune begins with some invisible head fired you up about seeing the real mechanics behind success stories, then do me a favor right now. Smash that like button to let the algorithm know this conversation matters. Share this video with every friend. and family member who needs to understand how wealth is actually built and let us keep exposing what they do not want you to see. I will catch you in the next one, where we break down the next hidden chapter in the lives of the ultra-wealthy. Until then, stay informed, stay skeptical, and remember that the myth of starting with nothing is comforting, but the reality of the head start is what actually moves the needle.